So just to kind of give some context for this, for what I'm going to talk about today, as Summer mentioned, I'm now working on a new book project that is sort of, broadly speaking, focused on sexuality and the politics of citizenship here. And there's really not, we could talk about it in Q&A if you're interested, but what I'm doing is my larger, earlier book project, which looks at sort of very large comparative study of the history and politics of African and Hindu religions here, and I really didn't have any space whatsoever because it was already big and multi-leveled. There was just no space to properly deal with issues of gender and sexuality. So some of the observations and thoughts I've had about that all these years are going to now find their way into this new project. Not just those religions, but also religious dynamics and politics, cultural politics of religion and religious identification more generally. But it's also situated in conversation with the new work I'm doing in collaboration with the IGDS Sexual Cultures project, as well as a new interesting project we're formulating on masculinity, men and masculinities. And I'm getting ready to embark on some months of systematic, what in anthropology we call person-centered ethnographic interviewing, in order to generate a rich data set on people's life history experiences, specifically pertaining to all the issues I'm interested in. And I'm playing with and trying to develop a distinction between what I'm thinking of as secular versus sacred forms of citizenship, and how those different forms of citizenship play out in relation to people's sexual dissonance. So I'm not really going to talk about that per se, but I'm just kind of giving you a sense for where this talk, which is a very specific examination of politics and law in Trinidad and Tobago, I mean, in the context of the post-colonial West Indies, but specifically focusing on Trinidad and Tobago, I thought this would be perhaps the most valuable presentation to give in this forum. I think some of these materials are things that you'll be familiar with, but to actually put it all together and connect the dots with the kind of critical feminist analysis may not be as familiar. So I want to kind of rehearse that this kind of politico-legal trajectory over the last 40 years for you, and talk about it. So this is really, in a sense, forms the heart of probably chapter 2 of the next book, the kind of historical political context for this next book. So, like I said, this is a very, very specific talk looking at politics and law, legislative reform, legal discourse, and I think it's not only important, but it's on its own terms, but we're just on the cusp of a new gender policy, national gender policy being passed, one that's been slightly de-radicalized, and it fits actually quite perfectly within the analysis that I'm going to talk about in reference here. So that's also on my mind too as I make my way through this material. So let me just give you a 3-minute thumbnail of the argument, the analytic arc of the argument, and then I'm going to trudge through all of these laws and legal changes and legislative reforms and shifts in political discourse and debate. I am inspired by and building on the work of two scholars in particular, Jackie Alexander, who some of you may know. She's in fact a Trinidadian background, and Tracy Robinson, a legal scholar who's now at UW Mona. I think they're both fierce and amazing, and I really am inspired by them. So I'm synthesizing their work and extending it in the case of Trinidad and Tobago. So I'm not going to cite them and do all the kind of do all that referential work, but they are sort of here with me, and I'm working with them on each shoulder. Okay, so this argument stems from their work to a large extent, And the argument is that post-colonial West Indian nationalist projects have engaged in a process of heterosexualization, active heterosexualization of the legal code, of political discourse. And the corollary, the flip side of that endeavor has been the kind of progressive, specific othering of the homosexual as the other to the heterosexist kind of heteronationalist kind of project. And as we'll see in the cases of legislative reform and legal changes in political discourse, the emphasis, the sort of heteronationalist emphasis is an emphasis on a progressive, specific, kind of focused emphasis on procreative, reproductive, heterosexual conjugality, and the expansion and sort of upregulation of that as sort of at the heart of producing proper citizens. And so therefore, reproductive heterosexual conjugality as the locus of national development and progress. And we'll look at the ways that this has manifested in a series of different registers. So in other words, citizenship has become predicated in the post-colonial period, has become increasingly predicated on an emphasis on correct, legitimate, respectable sex and the policing and regulation of proper sexuality, which in turn delegitimates sexual citizenship and sexual rights for queer folks. You know, I'll just use that kind of loosely to include lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, although it's complicated if we were going to focus on each population or group of people, group of experiences. But what this does is this set, because the rules of the game have become progressively heteronationalist, it creates pressure, a pressure towards what I would call homonormativity. The idea that in order to get rights to play the game, you actually have to play the game according to the heteronationalist paradigm that's set out. So that means, you know, an emphasis on straight acting. You know, this is not, probably many of you are familiar with this kind of idea, but it does create this kind of pressure for homonormativity, creating a kind of political double bind for activists, for queer folks who are interested in change and in their own citizenship rights. And it also displaces and marginalizes those who are excluded from the homonormative kind of framework. So this is kind of the analytic arc of what we're dealing with, but I want to sort of take you in a very detailed, careful, systematic way through the case of Trinidad and Tobago. And then I want to end by reflecting on what I think is a kind of interesting, relatively unique aspect of resistance to sexual citizenship rights for queer folk, specifically in the post-colonial West Indies and in Trinidad and Tobago in particular. And in this instance, at the end, I'm actually comparing it with the United States, where it's a little bit different. I think more complicated here. The resistance to the kind of heteronationalist imperative and its resistance to progressive change on this front. Okay, so let's think about the colonial legal code, the colonial Caribbean set of laws. What you need to know is that colonial legislation targeted all forms of non-procreative sex as unnatural. And it did not, one of the critical things is that it did not focus on homosexuality per se. It focused on anything that wasn't procreative, that didn't, that reproduced children. So it included homosexuality, of course. But it also included married people, and it did not, the issue of consent was irrelevant, which is interesting as we get into the late 20th century period where debates and legislative issues having to do with consent and sexual violence and all these things become very, very, very the colonial West Indian laws in this regard also applied to adults and minors alike. There wasn't the distinction between adults and minors was not as salient as it became later. Penalties for what were known as buggery were especially harsh in the 19th century, but they were gradually relaxed turning into the 20th century. They were gradually relaxed. And again, this is salient for talking about what then happens later in the 20th century here. In this context, the kind of late colonial decolonizing movements or sentiments, the kind of gathering force and the emergence of a kind of anti-colonial, decolonizing, nationalist project or proto-project, we might say, over time came to focus more and more on working and lower class forms of reproduction as a kind of privileged site for the redemption of the masses in order to produce proper citizens, right? To create kind of legitimate, to approximate respectability and to create citizens out of, the kind of, morass of concubinage and illegitimate children, and you know that whole story. So, but what I'm trying to focus on and pull out here for our attention is that, so in a sense, reforming reproduction and reforming forms of heterosexual pair bonding became an important site for redeeming the colonial population and producing a proper nationalism with proper citizens. This, of course, built on the Euro-colonial preoccupation with unnatural sex, to be sure, but decolonizing West Indian nationalisms increasingly upregulated a specifically heterosexual, heterosexist focus on forms of reproduction, kinship, and social relations. So late colonial, early post-colonial marriage laws were under constant revision, and what happened was, over time, what were, before that point, extra-legal forms of conjugality, what we now know as common law marriages and also visiting relationships, for example, those progressively were sort of, those were encompassed within the orbit of proper marriage, in closer proximity to what was considered proper, respectable marriage. And these laws, the expansion of the orbit of legitimate conjugal heterosexual relations were expanded over the course of the 20th century. So in other words, the legal code reproduced and reified the notion of non-reproductive sexual practice as unnatural and perverse, while categories of legitimate conjugality were being broadened to include more and more forms of reproductive heterosexual union. Seats over here, please. And as I said, at first, the first inclusion were common law marriages, which, by the way, before this point were considered marriages. Now they're referred to discursively as common law marriages, but it was that as an effect of this transformation, it wasn't a sort of, it wasn't just always the case. And then even visiting relationships became gradually incorporated within this kind of umbrella of respectable heterosexual union. Now, as we get into the post-colonial period, there were a wave of feminist-inspired legal reforms in the 80s and 90s, reflecting global feminist politics, the movement for greater recognition of women's rights in the form of domestic violence laws, sexual offenses, provisions, and other family law reforms, of which much could be said. But the point here that I want to draw out is that all of these also further naturalize the notion of heterosexual pair bonding and reproductive conjugal relations and nuclear family formations as in some cases in the legal text, as in fact it was explicitly formulated as the fundamental building block of society. Okay? In 1998, in Trinidad and Tobago, the Cohabitational Relationships Act further moved in this direction by expanding property rights and financial obligations analogous to marriage proper, applying only to heterosexual cohabitation. But in this case, I mean, that's pretty profound actually to expand and create property rights and financial obligations within what 50 years before would have been considered. Yeah, I mean, it was just like a moot point. So in this sense, this act too, by focusing on conjugal relationships that produce children, it again reaffirmed the centrality of heterosexual reproduction as kind of like the heart of the matter. And then the term cohabitant now has been mainstreamed in subsequent legislation and discourse, so that, for example, the amendments to the sexual offenses law in 2000 used the term cohabitant. That's just like a basic kind of key word in the discourse. What is relevant to mention here before I backtrack a little bit and focus on legislative changes and reforms having to do with homosexuality per se, Trinidad and Tobago has been a kind of role model in all of this, whether it's the domestic violence laws and all of these kinds of late 20th century, well, post-colonial, but especially the last couple of decades of legal changes and legislative reforms. Trinidad and Tobago's legal code has been a kind of role model in a sense, in that it's been like the first, and then the Bahamas followed suit, and all these other territories followed suit, and then their codes or their reforms use language and use as a source domain what happened here. And either tacitly through omission, or in some cases, or explicitly in others, all of these legislative reforms have excluded same-sex relations. So in that sense, it really has been a kind of heteronationalist effort. All right, so let me backtrack again to the colonial West Indian legal code. What mattered was the sex you had, whether it was procreative, in other words. Whereas by the late 20th century, the issue has increasingly become who you have sex with. And one of the effects of this has been a homosexualizing of the concept of buggery, which now most people think of that as the same thing, right? That's how we define it. But in fact, again, this is an effect of these changes. It's not just been a sort of constant. And again, Trinidad and Tobago has been a leader. What I'm getting at is that the definition of buggery has been refined and focused, narrowed, focused, and homosexualized, and the punishment for that offense has been increased actively over the course of the 20th century. So let me start giving examples. The 1969 Immigration Act, Trinidad and Tobago Immigration Act of 1969, which was last amended in 2005, prohibits homosexual non-citizens from entering the country and also provides for their deportation. Now that, as I mentioned, this act was amended in 2005 and was not changed. So, as with all of these other cases, it's not an instance of, oh, well, this is a taboo subject, and it's kind of left in the corner, and it'll eventually change, and maybe we'll get around to it. No, there's active, explicit kind of reproduction of these forms of discrimination in the legal code. Of extremely pivotal importance for Trinidad and Tobago, but also the entire Commonwealth Caribbean, was the Trinidad and Tobago Sexual Offences Act of 1986, which did a number of interesting things. It separated buggery and bestiality, which up until that time were in fact, because of the colonial preoccupation with proscribing any form of non-procreative sex, bestiality, buggery, and many things were kind of just in the soup, right? They were just kind of the thing that they were all together. So in 1986, the Sexual Offences Act separated buggery and bestiality, narrowed the definition of buggery to focus on anal sex, in particular, which it had not done before, it raised the maximum sentence to 10 years imprisonment for buggery. It raised and reduced the sentence for bestiality at the same time. That's amazing. I mean, yeah, it's amazing. So the state wants you to, well. Its discourse regarding sexual intercourse, listen to this, considered heterosexual rape natural. Yes, violent and non-consensual, and therefore reprehensible, but it still literally talked about it as a natural thing. Whereas consensual homosexual activity was, again, spoken about and formulated as unnatural. So that's a very interesting kind of distinction that's emerging, and the whole issue of consent is now coming on the radar screen. And the issue of consent, I'm focusing on a very particular thread through all this material, but the issue of consent came up because of reforming rape legislation, issues having to do with domestic violence and sexual predation, and the Sexual Offenses Act of 1986 was not that progressive in terms of marital rape. There was a kind of backing off. It was a backing off of marital rape, and it wasn't even referred to as rape. There was kind of like real rape outside the marital sphere, and then there was non-consensual sexual advances of a husband toward the wife. That was actually changed again in 2000. I'll get to that. But in any case, what I want to point out is at this moment, legally speaking, politically legally speaking, heterosexual rape was formulated as natural, whereas non-consensual homosexual sex was framed as unnatural. And indeed, a byproduct of the at that time, new gender-neutral rape laws meant that there was no need for a buggery provision anymore in cases of non-consensual anal sex. Follow me? Because the move was toward gender neutrality in terms of rape. So in a sense, the effect was to narrow the sphere of the buggery or sodomy statute to prohibiting consensual anal sex in particular. Now, at the same time, the Sexual Offenses Act created a new category of offense called serious indecency, which was a modification of what before an inheritance from the colonial period was known as gross indecency, going actually back to the 20th century British legislation, the Offense Against the Persons Act. The new category of serious indecency is defined as any use of the genitals to arouse or gratify desire that does not involve intercourse. And that was proscribed and criminalized. However, there was also a clause, a subsequent clause, that excludes husbands and wives and any consensual relations between a man and a woman. Right? So in effect, again, the outcome is a kind of is a criminalization of homosexual activity. All right. 1986 Sexual Offenses Act is also the moment in which female homosexual activity is also explicitly criminalized for the first time, which Yasmin Tambaya points out as a pretty poignantly ironic effect of the trends toward gender equality. So, as I mentioned, the Sexual Offenses Act was amended in 2000 in order to better protect victims of sexual violence, and it extended the kind of paradigm of gender neutrality and also reformed kind of further protected women within marriage. It kind of took a little bit, it diminished the sanctity of husbands' sort of power within the marital arena. However, at the same time, consensual same-sex relations became even more criminalized than ever. This is in 2000. Despite the expansion of the definition of rape, which might have otherwise dealt with non-consensual sexual predation of any kind. And indeed, the punishment for consensual adult buggery was increased from 10 to 25 years. This body of legislative reforms also moved toward the criminalization of HIV transmission for the first time, which is itself really interesting and important, and I am not even competent enough to talk about HIV and the law and these changes. But I do want to note that because it's important, and it's also the kind of rising specter of HIV and AIDS at the time was partly how all of these changes were rationalized by politicians and through the legal process. Oh, we got to protect our, the national citizenry from these diseases from outside, and this gay thing coming in. Okay. All right, so meanwhile, in 1999, the UNC government at the time withdrew Trinidad and Tobago from the 1969 American Convention on Human Rights. And the motivation for doing this was as a kind of dissident move against, because Trinidad and Tobago, there's some enthusiasm for the death penalty in Trinidad and Tobago. And so the UNC government in 1999 pulled out of the American Convention on Human Rights, which was established in 1969, in order to decrease the government's obligation to honor the strictures of that international human rights instrument, which was against the death penalty. Now, but that being a signatory to that convention meant it implicated a whole series of state protections against certain forms of discrimination. So what the government did at that time, in pulling out of that convention, the government of Trinidad and Tobago legislated in its stead the Equal Opportunities Act, which, if you're paying attention, you probably know something about these days. And the Equal Opportunities Act explicitly protected a whole range of categories of experience from discrimination, sex, origin, religion. There's a list of them. However, it doesn't just leave out sexual orientation from its roster of protected categories of experience. In fact, it explicitly said we are not sexual orientation is not included in this legislation. It wasn't. So what I'm saying is it wasn't just left out. Oh, this is a taboo topic. I'm a little afraid of dealing with it. It's no. We're going to specifically exclude you from protection by the state. Okay, as you know, the PNM under Manning was notoriously homophobic. Perhaps the most kind of well-known or infamous case on the international stage was in 2009 when Manning was chair of CHOGM. And at the time, there was a fierce international controversy raging because in Uganda, there were legislative reforms in Uganda proposed by Yoweri Museveni in order to make it law that if you knew about any homosexual activity, you would have to report it to the state. Any convicted homosexual activity would be life imprisonment, and any homosexual activity that transmitted HIV would be punished by death. Right. So this was the issue burning at the CHOGM meetings, or one of the big ones. And at the time, in the face of that, as chair of CHOGM, Manning said, we will not be concerned, or he dismissed any proactive or progressive attention to homosexual concerns or gay rights in the face of this controversy, and in effect basically saying, okay, each country has their own sovereignty to do what you want. We get our death penalty. You get to have your, Uganda gets to have whatever they want to do. All right. So, and this PNM rhetoric continued in the run-up to the May 2010 elections here that brought the People's Partnership into power, including depicting their opponents as overly liberal in order to woo the conservative Christian vote. This is stuff I'm sure you know. However, I want to point out that the PP coalition was actually, in fact, not that much better in this sense. For example, Kamla Prasad-Bursesser touted referenda regarding abortion and homosexual rights. She said, well, we need to have referenda in order to deal with these issues, which is, I'm very critical of that. That sort of looks like democracy, but it's a way of kicking the can down the road and letting the population, basically the bias of the population, rule. And I think it's not acceptable. That's one case. She also, a little less under the radar, but was wooing the evangelical vote by promising to protect marriage. And she even touted the UNC's 1999 Equal Opportunities Act as, hey, look, we did this. You don't have to be worried about us being too liberal because look at what we did when we were in power. Another example is Makambel Daga, who was then COP candidate for Laventille West. He used his electioneering speeches to rant against the failure of national institutions, and his first instance was how schools are producing homosexuals as a sort of sign of how national institutions are failing. Still, after the People's Partnership's successful election, Kamala surprised everyone in her Indian Arrival Day speech, in which she did include sexual orientation. And it's interesting too, it was the Mahasabha's Indian Arrival Day celebration in which she made this speech. I have the text somewhere. She included sexual orientation in the list of wrongful forms of prejudice and discrimination that are unfair and wrong. But things kind of have gone downhill since that time, is my estimation. For example, in December of 2010, the government abstained from a vote at the UN with regard to an amendment restoring sexual orientation to the language of a resolution condemning extrajudicial, summary, and arbitrary executions. That provision had been recently blocked by a coalition of African, Arab, and Muslim countries. And what's especially interesting and dramatizes Trinidad and Tobago's position is the fact that the majority of independent Caribbean nations, including Jamaica, backed it. But Trinidad and Tobago nonetheless abstained on that vote. So what that means is that the government didn't have a position on basic right to life, based on, even if it's illegal, if do gay people have a right to, not be summarily or arbitrarily executed or extrajudicially? The government didn't have a response. Meanwhile, the specter of same-sex marriage arose in the context of parliamentary debate in February of last year, in the context of debate regarding the Statutory Authorities Amendment Bill, which extended state support to heterosexual spouses of deceased civil servants, as well as expanded those benefits to common law couples. So if there was a common law marriage and one of the spouses was a civil servant, then there were state benefits that would accrue to the deceased, the widow or widower of that civil servant, including in a common law conjugal pairing. And probably some of you know that it was in that debate that independent Senator Korean Baptist McKnight observed, she said, but hey, should we be talking about same-sex marriages? And she was interrupted by Senate Leader Subhas Pandey, who reminded her, which it turned out after the fact was incorrect. He said, but what about chapter 52 of the book of Leviticus, which was actually incorrect? He got it wrong. And debate was then quickly squelched in Parliament. So it is worth reflecting on or considering the palpable irony of a Hindu politician invoking biblical morality to support a form of discrimination in an ostensibly secular parliament, right? Now, this I'm going to get back to at the end when I talk about some, I think, kind of complexities of resistance to change in Trinidad and Tobago in particular, involving religious cultural politics. But before I do, I want to point out that in June of last year, the Equal Opportunities Act was amended last year in order to update and ostensibly in relation to this bill right now, there's agitation for change. Unfortunately, Jackie and Tamara aren't here, but there are two lawyers who are spearheading a Tell Your Story TNT project in which they are documenting cases of discrimination to present to the Equal Opportunity Commission, because the Equal Opportunity Commission says people aren't discriminated, no one's complaining, so why should we change anything? So their project is to systematically document cases of discrimination in order to actually have to substantially put it there and say, yes, actually, people are afraid because they're not protected, but here are some cases and this is why it needs to be changed. And this amended Equal Opportunities Act now sits next to the Cohabitational Relationship Act and the Domestic Violence Act, all of which now specifically excludes sexual orientation from state protection. So now, if you think that I am being overly pessimistic or critical, for the sake of precision, we need to acknowledge a few positive glimmers and tentative hope on this otherwise bleak political legal horizon. One, in October of last year, the government accepted the United Nations Human Rights, Human Rights Council's periodic review, they do national reviews. And that review, last year's review, said the government of Trinidad and Tobago is not protecting their citizens in this regard, and it needs to do a better job of that. And actually, this government did acknowledge, they accepted it. They said, okay. Which is better than a decade ago when the government actually claimed, in the face of a similar kind of critique from the UN, that there was no discrimination against related to sexual orientation in Trinidad and Tobago. So if you call that progress, things are getting better. The Data Protection Act, this point was brought to me by Colin Robinson, who I respect enormously. The Data Protection Act of 2011 includes sexual orientation among the areas in which an individual's right to privacy is ensured. So, this isn't a massive major thing, but it is embedded explicitly in the legislative text of this act, which is important, but also could create, a small little trickle of precedent for other changes. And it's important to acknowledge that. Indeed, we're dealing with a very complicated situation. The government of Trinidad and Tobago also remains signatory to two OAS, Organization of American States, resolutions adopted in 2008 and 2009 regarding sexual citizenship rights and the necessity of state protection against discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. And I am given to understand, although I don't know that much about it and I don't exactly know how to characterize it, but I'm given to understand that the National Judiciary has recently adopted self-imposed guidelines for curbing discrimination based on sexual orientation within the legal process. That's actually something that I'd like to find out more, and I just haven't got a chance and don't have the right connections yet. So yeah, I want to acknowledge that there are, we're dealing with a very complex situation, and there are, government, the law, politics, these are the leviathan of all of this. It's a complicated thing, so there are changes and microscopic changes that are worth noting, positive changes that are worth noting. Yet I think our optimism for progressive change must be tempered by taking the longer political, legal trajectory into account, in which ostensibly gender progressive trends across the region in terms of legislative reform concerning family law and sexual violence have also, in fact, actively catalyzed homophobic retrenchments in political discourse and national legal codes, especially in the case of Trinidad and Tobago, as we've seen. And I'll bring our attention back to the currently pending national gender policy, which is literally about to happen, it seems. This policy has long been in the making. It's just on the cusp of being passed under this government. However, in line with what I've been saying, I want to point out that a similar dynamic is also being played out again. What's happened is that certain kinds of, legitimate, progressive, feminist-inspired changes are being implemented and operationalized in this policy. However, the original draft policy submitted by our very own IGDS in 2004, which included sexual orientation and reproductive rights and abortion issues as part of the draft policy, have been gutted in order to get it through. So it's been de-radicalized in order to get to this point where it can be passed. But I think it's yet another, it's symptomatic of the same longer kind of 4 or 5 decade process in the post-colonial period in which gains are made at the expense, certain gains are made at the expense of others. And it's not willy-nilly, it's not haphazard. And I think all of this corroborates the critical feminist analysis of, as I mentioned at the beginning, Jackie Alexander and Tracy Robinson, that there's a certain kind of coercive and punitive heteronationalist, post-colonial heteronationalist project in the West Indies that has unfolded over time and has, in fact, in some important ways, ironically de-radicalized the kind of critical, radical edge of gender as not only an analytic but a political construct. And Robinson has written quite, I think, compellingly and importantly about how the notion of vulnerability has also gotten progressively feminized, and there's a kind of so that the state becomes the patron of feminine vulnerability, even if it's not vulnerability of women necessarily. I can't reproduce her analysis of all of that, but it does include it. So as a final, let me just offer a final reflection, because as an American anthropologist who knows the American scene well and has been coming and going from Trinidad and Tobago for 14 years and tracking the scene here as well, I do think it's interesting I've gradually dawned on me that the resistance to progressive change relating to the issues that I'm talking about here, I think are actually more complicated than the United States in several interesting ways. And it's complicated on both sides of the political spectrum, both the right and the left sides of the political spectrum. So let me tell you what I mean by that. On the right side and when we think of resistance to change in this regard, we automatically think of conservative religious, perhaps conservative Christian religious opposition to, which is definitely there, and it's that piece that is similar to the American situation. But what's going on here, and that I think makes it more complicated on the right side, is that because of the pluralistic, I mean, it's a pluralistic religious situation in the U.S., but the loudest, most effective, and pretty much the biggest voice against, critical voice is the conservative Christian voice. Whereas here, there's an interreligious kind of ecumenical solidarity that can develop between conservative Christian, Hindu, and Muslim opposition to sexual citizenship rights in this regard. And I think it actually, I would venture to say that it strengthens that religious opposition, because it's not just the sectarian interest of one tradition, but in fact, people can look across their, look into the other and say, hey, this is one area where we can lock arms and, uphold tradition and supposedly defend family values. And as someone who's been tracking both Hindu and African religious practices here, I'll also point out that there are now aspects of not just spiritual Baptists, but even in the Orisha movement, there's a kind of family value. There's a family value, a kind of conservative reflex that has developed that is worrisome. And for example, there's a what was the talk show on YL? The woman, she had short hair. Pardon?
Yoga.
Yes. A couple of years ago on her talk show, they had Colin Robinson, Luke Sinnott, but then they had one of these Pentecostal megachurch pastors from Shigwanis and an Orisha priest. And I mean, for me, someone who's written about and actually tracked the development of the Orisha movement over a number of decades, to see someone, a representative of a movement that was originally a radical anti-Christian critique of kind of Christian false consciousness and so forth, to see someone, I mean, I'm not saying this is everyone, I'm just saying that now there are elements of this, to see an Orisha, a sort of ensconced Orisha priest sitting on a talk show next to a Pentecostal evangelical preacher and agreeing that, gays are a problem and they're abomination is sobering, to put it mildly. I've also recently, just a couple of weeks ago, I learned about an Orisha shrine in Lavantil that has explicit, painted outside on its walls, it says no gays. I photographed it because I got in from Puerto Rico last night at midnight. I didn't have a chance to get the whole PowerPoint presentation together. But it explicitly says no gays, and on the other side of the entrance it says women must be properly dressed. So again, there's a sort of gender, there's a conservative, regressive gender politics being played out that scapegoats gay people in a domain that, in certain ways, at least at the grassroots level anyway, has provided a kind of alternative space for gender and sexual expression compared to the state-sanctioned, so-called established, religious traditions here. I have one more point, and then we'll open up for Q&A. So, I'm trying to make two observations relating to kind of conservative resistance to progress in terms of sexual rights. We have this more complicated conservative religious, ecumenical, interreligious kind of front on the right side of the political spectrum. But because this is also a post-colonial context, there's also resistance on the left. There's leftist resistance as well, which is secular. It doesn't have to do necessarily with religious tradition. So you have the anti-neo-colonial position, which says, we don't need your European gay thing here. So you have people like Michael Harris who are writing about it in this way, who articulate this position, who say, we don't need this because this is an outside position. So it's an anti-neo-colonial, it's a secular anti-neo-colonial position on the left, right? So we have a more I'm just working with a heuristic contrast between the American cultural politics of the American situation versus here. So you have a kind of more complicated situation on the right, but then you also have this anti-neocolonial dynamic playing out on the left. And then, so that makes an extra level of kind of strange bedfellows in terms of, resisting, upholding the, in the language of this talk, upholding the heteronationalist post-colonial project. So with that, I'll close. And I look forward to Q&A and discussions, comments, and so forth. I have more I can say, but I'm hoping I can work it into discussion. So I don't take it. Thank you.